Okay, good evening, everybody. So nice to see you all. Really nice turnout. Really nice to introduce a really special guest this evening. We have Doctora Rosa Vásquez Espinoza. She is many things, but she is technically a chemical biologist from Peru with roots in both the Amazon and the highlands. So she is a National Geographic explorer, and she's the founder of a nonprofit organization, Amazon Research International. This organization is dedicated to biodiversity research and conservation in the Amazon. She also does research on boiling rivers, non-stinging bees, medicinal plants, and the question of how to put together the two sciences, Western science and Indigenous science. She's a pioneer in many things, and in a country that I also love, Peru, she is very beloved. So it is very nice to welcome you today, Rosa. I turn over the table to you.
Thank you so much. Very kind introduction. Thank you so much for the invite as well to you and the whole department. How are you guys doing today? Thank you. It's a Friday towards the end of the day, so I figured the energies may be varying, but I appreciate you guys showing up to hear perhaps a different stories from the Amazon rainforest that I don't think most of the world has ever been exposed to or heard of. And I will start first by asking if any of you has been to the Amazon rainforest. Can you raise your hand if you have? And can you raise your hand if you wish to do go? And I don't take that for granted because I do get to speak to a lot of audiences, and I understand it's not everyone's dream to go and be sweaty and humid and hot and uncomfortable for days on end and perhaps sleep on the ground, but also to endless stars on the sky and waking up to the sounds of animals and intact lands in some areas. The Amazon rainforest is a place that I call home, and it's a place that was the home of my previous generations. So I was born and raised in the capital city, so a busy city, kind of like London, buildings and gray skies and cars honking the whole time. But I had an ancestry for both the Andes and the Amazon. We've been able to track it to semi-nomad people in the central Peruvian Amazon who lived in similar ways to communities that we work with actively today. For them, the Amazon rainforest is not just the most biodiverse place on Earth, but it's also their home. It's also their pharmacy. It is their hardware store, their clothing shop. It's everything. And they lived in a way that was harmonious with nature, taking what they needed, but making sure that they left enough for those that come next. So regenerating as they go. For those who haven't been able to be there yet, but will be able to go, the Amazon rainforest is going to be a place filled with sacred trees that are not just home to hundreds of insects and other animals, but it's where the spirits of grandfathers go to live when they die for certain communities, and filled with endless rivers and lakes that harbor so much life. And if you're just lucky to be in the right part of the Amazon, you may run into one of my favorite animals, the pink dolphin. Had you heard about pink dolphins before, I presume? They're not born pink, they're born gray, they become pink, and only the male becomes pink over time. Of course, this splash of life extends into the land territories as well, including one of our most beloved predators, the jaguar, who is not just an apex predator and so key for ecological cycles, but also such a strong guardian spirit for many shamans and spiritual leaders. If you look up in the sky, the range of biodiversity keeps on giving, with incredible birds of all sizes and colors in areas where they still exist. But the Amazon rainforest goes beyond the flora and fauna. when I think about biodiversity, I don't think just about our natural life forms, but I think about people as well. There's even now the term biocultural heritage, which was coined by United Nations to reflect that nature and people make up biodiversity, and we should think about it in interconnected ways, because I personally believe the fact that we have separated these systems is one of the reasons why our systems are broken right now. And the Amazon rainforest is also an interesting place because, unlike other ancestral civilizations in our planet, there are no written records led by our own people. And so where are those records? They live in songs, they live in textiles, they live in trees and the animals, and the origin and stories of origin that are still alive with those that can still tell the stories. And in this particular case, for example, I'm going to show you just a short clip of a song. Hold on, let me just play it again. Where these beautiful Ashaninka women are calling and singing for the trees to not go dry and to still stay standing. And they're calling for the rain to come back. And when we go in the details of that, they're really reflecting the worst effects of climate change that are impacting the people that have contributed to it the least. And amongst these people, as I mentioned, it's part of where my origins begin, a Seminoman community of people many generations ago that eventually migrated to the high Andes, where my grandmother was born and raised without access to schools or hospitals. She never learned how to read or write until well into her 60s and 70s. But she had a very close relationship with nature. It's all she knew, it's all she had seen ever since she was born. So what do you do when you're sick in these areas? You rely on the elders and you rely on the medicine around you. She has incredible stories that she tells me that she remembers following the elders in her community to the high mountains, all the way up 4,000 meters above sea level, where to the untrained eye, you would see no life. It's cold and things look brown. That's how she describes it. But she would see the elders patiently looking for small purple flowers that were really good to treat specific illnesses. So in her words, that is when she started to learn that every plant is a medicine, from the smallest to the largest. And when my family moved to the capital city so that my generation could attend school and have different opportunities, she ensured to build, even though it was a small garden space, to build a natural pharmacy that reflected the biodiversity she grew up with, both from the Andean mountains and the Amazon rainforest. And it is amongst these flowers and plants and even small trees that I spent every single time outside of school. She could perhaps not tell me about the biology and chemistry or genetics behind the processes she was following, which to me seemed very methodic and very accurate. She knew exactly when she was going to do certain harvesting, for how long she was going to soak different trees and roots, and the way in which she would combine them to get a specific outcome. To me, that's the first chemist I met. So perhaps she couldn't tell me that Western scientific perspective and reasons why things were working, but she would tell me cultural stories and spiritual ones as well. So to me, growing up, it was really normal and common to see someone talking to flowers and telling them thank you and asking for permission before you take them. And I believe that really it was this close relationship to not just the indigenous upbringing that I had, but also the playtime that I was allowed in nature. Spending time with my cousins, being in the Amazon River and going straight to the forest and getting fruits and just allowing for time of joy was what drove in me a really deep desire to understand nature through an additional lens. I was understanding it through the one that my family was teaching me, but I really wanted to dive deeper. I was learning things in school, and that is how I decided I wanted to become the first scientist in my family. Nobody knew what that meant. Nobody spoke English. And so, of course, that comes with its own sets of challenges. But fast forward, I was able to get a full ride scholarship to move to the United States and pursue 2 degrees in biochemistry and molecular biology. And then fast forward as well, a PhD in chemical biology at the University of Michigan, as well as a postdoctorate position over there. A really deep dive into academic science. And in that process, I was able to start thinking of independent projects that I wanted to lead. And of course, I kept thinking back, I want to go back to the rainforest. I want to do something with what I'm learning. And I quickly realized that I had to do things differently if I'm coming back to my own lands, doing academic research and focus on the scientific publications while not thinking about ideas, how that looks like in implementation, in policy, in capacity building, or allowing opportunity for indigenous people that perhaps did not have the chance I did to attend a private school and to learn English early on, to find ways that we can collaborate together. So then people like my grandmother, their knowledge is also recognized and elevated to the platform and level that it should be. So I moved to the UK about 3 years ago. I founded my organization based in Peru. We have a small local team there and do direct collaborations with indigenous communities, associations, universities, both in Peru and abroad as well. And I'm constantly in and out. Another question I do typically get asked, and I've noticed it comes with a little bit of judgment, is why do you live in the UK then? Why are you just not back in Peru? And I think it is really easy to ask those questions when one is not in the middle, when we realize that unfortunately places like Peru haven't necessarily always supported science and don't necessarily support indigenous-led science either. And so to have a foot outside, it is something that I have come to learn. It is absolutely vital to the work we do, not only to advocate, but to look for support and connections and to be able to carry the work forward. So what we do, and our whole premise is, we started the organization by really gathering people that believed in doing things differently for the Amazon rainforest through a scientific lens, in the sense that it brings ancestral knowledge not just to be integrated, but to be elevated and to be recognized in the different ways that to what has been done so far. And we have different programs now. I'll be telling you a few different stories that are also highlighted in my book. During my time in the PhD, I also became a National Geographic explorer, which has allowed me to dive in science communication in ways that I honestly didn't necessarily understand the impact it could have, and I'll be able to dive a little bit deeper later. So my work sometimes in the science communication space has taken me to really unnatural ecosystems to me. So this was the Lake Michigan, extremely cold. I am a tropical person. So yes, I am going to be suffering in the winter here. But sometimes it's also taken me to other rivers, in this case, a particular boiling river in the heart of the Amazon forest. Have you ever heard of the boiling river? There is an incredible TED Talk that you just Google Boiling River Amazon, you will find an incredible storyteller and scientist as well. It is the world's largest documented thermal river in our planet as of right now. The earliest written records we've been able to find as to for how long has it been boiling dates back to 1836, so over 200 years. And what is really interesting about this ecosystem is most thermal rivers in our planet, let's say Yellowstone National Park, or those in Ethiopia, Italy, Iceland, they are associated to a volcano. And it makes complete sense because that is what gives the energy for it to boil. There are no volcanoes in the Amazon River. And so that is not how it is getting this energy. There's been incredible geological work led by my colleague Andres Russo, who delivers this TED Talk and has a great book about it too. And the strongest theory so far is that when we look at the core of the Earth, of course, it is extremely hot, and there are natural cracks that happen throughout the different layers all the way to the surface. And so the strongest theory is that they have been able to see injections of hot water constantly flowing that keep feeding and building what is the boiling river, that, as you see here, the hottest spots reach 200 Fahrenheit, so 99.1 Celsius. So you will cook chicken here, which is what locals actually used to do before. They still boil their eggs and make their tea in this river. And as you see in the photo, it is so hot that when you're standing there, you can actually hear it. Of course, you can feel it because the vapor is rising with constant heat. It's scorching hot. It will make you dizzy. And add to that the fact that as you have to navigate across, you only have these rocks, and many of them end up being covered in algae, so it makes it really slippery. So you have to be absolutely present and really intentional with every single step. How I got to the boiling river, it was that because it's such an extreme space, people believe nothing can survive. Because the moment a small mammal confused the waters and approached it, of course it cooked from inside out right away. But to a scientific eye, the first thing you notice when you get to the hottest spots in this ecosystem is that you do have abundance of life. It's just different kind of life. It's microscopic. And you see it emerge in different colors, from your greens, your blues, your oranges, your pinks, even in some of the hottest and most extreme places. And this makes sense. We know microbes adapt so beautifully. Even PCR was developed thanks to an extreme enzyme that was found in the boiling waters of Yellowstone. What is also really different and interesting about the boiling river of the Peruvian Amazon is that, unlike most thermal systems globally, that trees and flora don't like to be around that. It's too hot, it's too intense, same for us. But here you find thriving flora around, with some of the plants that I have seen almost as tall as me growing in some of this really, really hot boiling mud. So that really starts to open the question as to, is there a unique symbiosis that is happening with some of these extreme enzymes, extreme microbes, fungi, that is allowing for this relationship to occur, the same that we know happens in Yellowstone with panic grass and other ecosystems. But to even just start to play with those questions, you need to know what's there in the first place. And that is what we started to do during my PhD and my postdoctorate, was to create the first map of microorganisms in this area, from the hottest spots to when eventually the river cools down enough that people go inside and swim in it. And we were able to not only generate quite a broad view about the microscopic life there, but also being able to discover 9 microbial species that were new to science and name them after cultural spirits that the local people associate this river with, not only as a way to give the power back, but that also they can use this as a way to advocate for protection of this space that unfortunately is heavily being logged by invaders. Another really cool, relatively new project that we have launched this year in collaboration with an amazing Oxford graduate, actually. She's a postdoc at Brown now, Dr. Elodie Freeman. It's on a question that came to my head during a less typical scenario. And it is whether animals can self-medicate or not. Have you guys heard about the area of science zoopharmacognosy? For those that haven't, zoo from animal, pharma from medicine, and cognosy from knowledge. So it is the area of study that is looking at how animals medicate, whether that is when they're actively ill and they're taking something the same way we would take a prescription, for example, to make themselves feel better, or when they're there strengthening their immune system the same way we would take vitamins, and vice versa. If you have ever seen, for example, a dog or a cat eat grass and as a way to purge themselves, it is that idea, but applied into the wildlife of our planet. I see my dog do that all the time. He knows specifically what grass he wants to go and munch on to kind of clean himself. And this is not a new concept. It has been demonstrated with incredible examples. For example, in Asia, there are elephants that have been observed chewing on a specific tree bark to induce labor, and women in the nearby community making tea with that tree bark to induce labor. The work led by Elodie herself in Uganda, in Africa, for example, of chimps observed being eating specific medicinal leaves to treat different conditions. One example that I particularly love was there's this particular leaf that acts like Velcro, and when chimps have a lot of parasites, so they're infected, they eat the leaf whole, and then the parasites stick to this Velcro-like leaf and then poop it out, and then the parasites come out, and then people in the nearby area consuming other plants of that leaf for parasite infections as well. So the reason why this, not only is it, I find it absolutely fascinating on one side, if we knew what kind of flora is useful for animal health, could this be something that we integrate into reforestation and restoration programs so that not only are we benefiting native flora that benefits the whole ecosystem, people, traditional medicine for people, and economies, but that is also supporting animal health, especially in places like the Amazon rainforest, where unfortunately a lot of restoration and reforestation projects historically happen with foreign floral species. But also, could this open our minds to the idea as to how do we even acquire medicinal knowledge? That's something I had never even asked myself, considering even the history that within my family, my grandmother was an Indian healer, and she has she had a healer grandmother herself as well. And if you ask this question, how do you acquire medicinal knowledge, to someone like my grandmother, she will tell you, well, I learned it from the elders. So that's a clear one way. If you ask that question to ayahuasqueros, which is shaman or healers that practice the traditional medicine of ayahuasca, which is considered a plant medicine in the Amazon rainforest, they will tell you that they acquire new knowledge through ayahuasca visions and dreams. So as they are in the experience of ayahuasca, it happens in multiple ways per the descriptions of the colleagues we work with, whether it's that they see a plant and then they have a specific feeling in their bodies, which then tells them that the plant would have some sort of impact on that body part, or whether they have a conversation with a plant spirit. So there you have two ways in which people from these territories claim to be acquiring medicinal knowledge. But with this, I think there is a third option that kind of opens up, which makes sense in my head when we think about the evolution of our planet and humanity. Could it be that it is through observation of animal behavior that we've also been inspired to explore specific medicinal plants? And I think there's even many more arguments that make this more interesting when, for example, we look at ayahuasca itself. Ayahuasca is a specific vine, but for it to have the specific effects it has in the body, there has to be a second plant that it's combined with it. When you look the physiology of both of these two plants, they look very different to one another, and they also grow in very different spaces. So when we look at the 10,000, if not more, plant species that we have in the Amazon rainforest, statistically, it doesn't make sense that they're just going to go and combine those. So I think through stories and through the work that we've been doing, we kept hearing stories about people observing jaguars consuming certain medicinal plants, or tapirs consuming these other things. And eventually we have been able to partner not just with Elodie, but with incredible Ashaninka scientists that we're working with to start exploring this question for the first time in the Amazon. But the very first step is to know where the animals hang out. And to do that, in some of the spaces we work with, which is one of the largest reserves in Peru that has never had camera traps installed, it becomes a really big challenge. How do you identify animal movement across 1 million hectares when you don't have that much budget? And so we ended up developing an indigenous-led method led by our Ashaninka partners to identify where many of these endangered fauna are living. And I'm just going to share a short, beautiful clip from this year. I was in this exact territory in July, so just a few months ago. And by the end of our field work, one of the last days, we were taking just a stroll 5 minutes away from where we were camping. And we saw fresh footprints of a baby jaguar from maybe a day or two ago. We never saw the mama's footprints, but I assure you they would be around. And I imagine that they already knew where we were, except we, of course, never came face to face with them, just through the camera traps. So hopefully next year we'll be able to share more about how this project develops. We have a really stellar Kukama young scientist who's training to be a biologist in the north of Peru right now, who is really excited about exploring biodiversity that has not been reported before in her part of the Amazon. And she has this really cool idea to start looking at biofluorescent life. So have you guys seen videos of deep, dark oceans where you have fluorescent or bioluminescent glowfish, jellyfish, sorry, or different kind of like fish that because of the pressure of being in constant darkness, they develop these other methods to communicate, whether it's to attract prey or to attract mates and etc. There are experts that call this the language of light, this ability that under deep darkness, they develop this incredible ability to communicate. For a long time, it was believed that these abilities were reserved to the deep ocean. When we are looking at two mechanisms, bioluminescence is different one from biofluorescence, but it did open the question as to could there be also a mechanism of communication through biofluorescence? And scientists are starting to just open the question to other ecosystems in our planet, not necessarily just the deep ocean. And over time, this ability to biofluorescence has now been reported in sharks, in turtles, for example, in California, in squirrels, in owls, different kind of birds, really spanning like different groups of life. And when now we think back about the Amazon rainforest, when I was having this chat with Abby, there are areas that are so covered by really, really intense canopy where you won't really see sunlight for long periods of time, or even sometimes days at a time, in her experience and mine as well. And so could this have led to some sort of evolutionary pressure for the wildlife there to also develop some abilities to biofluorescence? So this is just right now a concept. We've just been doing some testings with Abby Taco. She's really excited about this. The photo here is a scorpion. Most scorpions in the world glow by virtue of their bioskeleton. But we've been able to see so far a cricket who is only able to glow from the head, as well as a small glass frog that only gets to glow from the eyes, which is really exciting. So she's really hoping to be able to develop this into a larger project, and just as a first pass, report what kind of biodiversity is able to do this, perhaps formulate theories as to why, and then eventually being able to understand how. The photo is really bad. We were not ready to even find anything, to be fairly honest. But this is a tiny, tiny glass frog, the size of my fist, if not smaller, that we found within these leaves. And it had really deep, dark, black eyes. But the moment we shine some UV light on it, its two eyes were just completely glowing. And it was, I cannot even describe the intensity of that when you are in complete darkness in the Amazon rainforest. And I want to make sure I'm not going over time. How much time do we have? We're okay. I get very excited to talk about some of these things. So the last story I'll share with you guys is what has become our largest and most visible program, the one we've worked on the longest. And before I dive deeper, or before you think I'm just like seeking adrenaline in my life, have you guys ever heard about the stingless bee? Can you raise your hand if you have? And I get to speak to audiences of all ages and of all really realms of life, from school to industry and academia and etc. And I have had many cases where in an audience of 1,000 people, I'll have no one raise their hand, because that's how little we really generally have heard about stingless bees outside of academic spaces. And this shot we did for National Geographic, because when we first kind of brought this project to light, we realized, one, even within Peru, most people had never heard about stingless bee. They didn't even know that these creatures existed, but this also extended globally. And how do you communicate about a animal, the bee, that we all know we have emojis for? We all grew up kind of even running from their buzzing because we're afraid to get stung. How do you communicate that within a second to at least open the conversation to what we think is one of the most key species to regenerate the Amazon rainforest? So we got inspired by a shot that Angelina Jolie had done for National Geographic, but in her case, she did it with stinging bees. I don't think I would have ever dared to do that. They did it to bring awareness to female beekeepers working in Africa. So we decided to recreate something similar, but instead of doing it in a white wall studio, doing it with the Amazon rainforest as our backdrop. And it took about 4 hours to get this shot, and it was absolutely worth it. So stingless bees, you see in this photo, some do not have a stinger, some have a truncated stinger. Bottom line is they cannot sting you. That doesn't mean they're defenseless, and I'll show that in a little bit. There are records that this is the oldest documented bee species in our planet from 65 million years or to 80 million years ago, so from the time of the dinosaurs. And it was discovered because of there was a fossilized resin that was found in now what is now known as the area of New York, where the scientists were not interested in insects. They were looking at tree resins, and there just happened to be a tiny stingless bee frozen in time. And that was the only clue we had. When they looked at modern times and like its current modern living relative, they realized it is from the Amazon rainforest. You find them all around our tropics. So if you follow the equator line, you will find stingless bees from Costa Rica, Mexico, Australia, Asia, Africa, and of course, the Amazon rainforest. Globally, we have about 500 to 600 documented species. I would say that we definitely must have more. In the Peruvian Amazon alone, and only considering the northern region, we have 175 documented species. With the experts, we estimate this is at least double just by what we've been able to see so far. And we have collaborations ongoing so we can document some of what we believe are the new species we're seeing. Some look like in the previous photo, more similar to a bee you're used to see. Some look completely different. And I gotta be honest, when I first saw the one you're seeing in this photo in real life, I thought they were ants because they were the size of a grain of rice, entirely black bodies. They were absolutely tiny. And some can be really large as your biggest bumblebee here in the UK, for example. Bottom line is they still don't sting you, but they have other ways to defend themselves. So they can bite, they have unidentified toxins in their saliva, they use medicinal resins from trees around, which helps to deter ants and other pests because they are rich in antibacterials. And in terms of biting, I actually have never had a bad issue with them, although sometimes they would bite me in the hands and I would barely feel it. But last year, one of them must have decided it was really tired of seeing my face. And so it decided to bite me right on my left eyelid. Nothing happened at the moment. The next day, my eye did puffed up. This was already better. But that was not the worst because that kind of recovered quite quickly. But must have been from the toxins that they have in their saliva that the doctor believed maybe some sort of microcrystals ended up forming in my eye. Bottom line, for the next 2 months, it felt as if I had a piece of glass stuck in my eyeball. So every time I was blinking, it was hurting. So definitely not defenseless. And I have this short clip to kind of summarize what part of our work is on. It's been over 2 hours and I actually think we're a bit lost. And I don't even know how we're gonna find the stingless bees. There are a gazillion suns around us. To look for stingless bees in the middle of the jungle is like to look for a needle in a haystack. We have been working on creating a map of stingless bees around Peru. I'm hoping that by more people being aware of stingless bees, that we can directly regenerate the Amazon rainforest. The bees are disappearing, and we have got to get this data so we can advocate for legal protection. 2 in 3 foods that we eat daily depend on bees. If bees disappear, the world has less than a year to survive. The Amazon rainforest is not for the faint-hearted. It can definitely get very dangerous. This is an area rich in some of the most dangerous snakes in the world. It can get extremely hot and extremely humid, so you have to watch out for extreme dehydration. You have to navigate virgin paths, which means you really don't know where you're going. You're building a path as you go. Very unstable and slippery.
Creo que este es el sonido de la pared.
So it seems like Heriberto has heard the bees. I genuinely cannot hear them just yet, but I trust him.
Wow. No, no las veo, pero las escucho fuerte.
Sí.
Esta especie es una de las que hace las mieles más medicinales.
Sí.
We have to be very careful, very accurate, annotate every detail very precisely, because we have got to have precise information of the location, the environmental conditions in which these exist, so that we can monitor how climate change, deforestation are impacting them. This is how we get to save the stingless bee and the Amazon.
Ha sido
Everyone voted in favor. Everyone, yeah. I can't. I'm just in shock. I could cry.
I did cry, just to break the ice. So when we started this project, it was already a few years ago, and we had all these great ideas on what to do for science. We knew what the communities wanted in terms of how to translate that science for positive economies and regeneration. But we realized quickly that we kept facing a big obstacle, which was nobody in Peru could either open funding or really provide more concrete support at any level, not even just national, regional, or municipality level, because there was no mention about stingless bees anywhere in the law. And the only law that did talk about bees talked about European bees, Apis mellifera, that is not native in Peru. They were brought into in the 1500s when the Europeans first came in South America. And of course, they adapted really quickly and they took over, displacing stingless bees. And we realized that that kept being a wall that we kept facing. And so very, very innocently, we asked, well, what if we try to change that? And perhaps it was the right combination of naivety, because I'm sure everybody thought we were crazy. We're an independent group of scientists and community members and leaders without any experience in law. So we partnered with environmental lawyers that knew better. And we're able to kind of gather evidence, scientific evidence, cultural knowledge, support and letters from everybody that stingless bees represent not just this important pollinator, but for whom stingless bees represent their ancestors, represent a source of traditional medicine that in some areas is the only medicine they get, like it would have been the case for my grandmother. And as well for some people that claim they only get their fruits and vegetables thanks to the stingless bee. And we got nowhere at the beginning, over 100 to 200 letters and emails and calls, until we started to get attention in the media outside of Peru. And with the first articles we got with National Geographic and a few others, suddenly people in Peru did start to answer to us. And that is how eventually we kept presenting our data and kept showing what we were doing. And got surprised December last year that they were going to decide to vote on whether to change that law and make a new one to do recognize stingless bees as Peru's native bees. And what's interesting about Peru is that they debate the laws live online on YouTube. So you can see what happens. And we were really surprised to see that everybody voted unanimously. And in January this year, a new law was created, which it now recognizes stingless bees as the native bees of the country. And we are now starting to already see, even just throughout this first year, the type of implementation that is leading across the country, which has really been exciting and promising to see. Beyond that, we knew that was only the first step. A conversation that started from the very beginning is that communities wanted stingless bees to be recognized as more than just pollinators, but as beings with intrinsic value. So rights of nature became a really easy extension of their worldviews. And we wanted to approach it in a way that it was not just community-led, but that it was science-based, because we have seen very beautifully that across the regions where we're working, in some of the most remote places I have ever been, people and communities and leaders are really keen to take on science, really keen to lead it as well, and to welcome collaboration when done properly, when done fairly and ethically. And so, again, we've been working bottom up as to what does this look like? How would it be actually implemented? And gathering everyone that has an interest in coming together for bees and starting to put it into action before we even advocated this with a municipality to show to ourselves and others that it would even work. And I'm happy to go into detail afterwards, but just a few weeks ago, we actually got a municipality to pass the first local law that now we believe has become the first world case where an insect has been granted legal rights the stingless bee now has the rights to exist, thrive, regenerate, have access to clean habitats, to healthy flora, to fair trade and positive economies that are supporting people. And there are already plans to co-design and co-develop a whole implementation plan with that municipality, and there are others that want to follow. The project on stingless bees began by interest from the communities to understand about what they call their liquid miracle. So stingless bee honey is revered as a really powerful medicine. And when the pandemic hit and everything was shut down, we learned that communities were using primarily two resources to treat the different symptoms that they were facing. One plant and stingless bee honey. And this was observed across different cultures, across different ecosystems and regions, even areas that were not talking to one another. And we quickly realized with our colleagues, Cucama scientist Dr. Cesar, as well as Richard Demetrio, sorry, I don't know why his name is not showing, that the stingless bee honey was used for more than just upper respiratory infections. People were using it for infertility, for eye cataracts, inflammation, wounds, and just a variety of illnesses that we have documented ever since, both for Cucama people with Cucama scientist Dr. Cesar, as well as for Ashaninka people led by Richard, the Ashaninka scientist in Peru. But they wanted to see, is there actually something happening in the chemistry? Is there anything that backs this up from the scientific perspective? And we ended up running Peru's first chemical analysis for stingless bee honey, a very initial step, very tentative preliminary identification, but enough to know that we had somewhere to hold on to. And we ended up seeing what became hundreds of healing molecules or healing structures known to be attributed to specific biological properties. We're extending this now into what's going to become a master thesis starting next year, led by an Amazonian student, to dive deeper, to analyze it beyond the only two stingless bee species that we were looking at this. With this work, the value of stingless bee honey was able to rise close to 500% in some instances. So it has become now a true source of economy for some communities. And this has been a long process, of course. There are still many things to continue to develop, but the rights of nature approach was part of that, to have some sort of legal framework that we're pairing with something called biocultural community protocol, so that as things develop, they're done with the indigenous leadership with a seat on the table. The project that you saw, and I think I'm kind of running short on time, so I'll go a little bit quick. The project that you saw in the video was a documentary we did with the BBC last year. We realized we didn't even know where stingless bees were across the Amazon rainforest. We knew that they are disappearing by testament of what people are sharing, by the fact that it takes us 7-8 hours to even find a wild hive, when before it would take 30 minutes. And so we've started to work on creating the first map of stingless bees across Peru, and hoping to expand this into a few neighboring countries with colleagues that are really keen to join. They're really hard to find. Most of them nest inside hollow trees with an entrance no larger than a coin. That's your only clue to find them. Now try to do that with thousands of trees around you. And the Cucama people do search for them at night. Why? Because at night the bees return back to their hive, and the hollow trees that they're living in amplify their buzzing. So it almost feels like loud static that you are following in pitch darkness. Really meditative experience if you ever want to try it. But of course, the night rainforest comes with its own set of challenges. In my opinion, just really fun adventures, including what has the Guinness World Record as the most poisonous caterpillar in the world. It was about the length of, kind of like my hand like that, the caterpillar you're seeing there, quite thick as well. Each of these spikes contains enough toxins to make you bleed from the eyeballs within 2 hours, which has happened, not to anybody in our team. There is an antidote. As well, some of the areas we're working with happen to be territories that the Amazonian bushmaster loves. It's a pit viper, if you've never heard of it. It is considered a very dangerous one, but for local Amazonians, even more so, because it's believed to be the only snake to follow you. And I have some stories about that if anybody wants to hear it. The BBC team was not happy to be going around these areas, to be fairly honest. Our work has been covered in the science cover of the New York Times and a bit of other different media, which to us has been extremely critical, not just to raise awareness about stingless bees and wild pollinators in general, but to really drive action in Peru and to be heard with the laws that I mentioned and the work that we're driving. Earlier this year, I was really surprised when I received a call from the ministry that I was going to be receiving the Order of Merit in Peru, which is the country's highest state recognition, so equivalent to a presidential medal, I believe. And I was here, I couldn't travel back home. It was like in a day and a half. But honestly, I couldn't think of anybody better than my own grandmother to receive it. So I say that was her graduation. I launched my first book earlier this year. It's very adventure-led, because I realized we don't often hear about this incredible, lesser-known wildlife and ecosystems and indigenous wisdom that it's so alive and rich and still existing in the Amazon rainforest as a way to bring out that wonder and the sense of hope, not just from our jungles, but to motivate others to look at the beauty around them. And I'll just close with leaving you with a question for as you continue on your Friday evening. What moment in nature captured you when you were a child and gave you an emotion, whether that was wonder or joy or fear, but some sort of emotion that made you feel alive? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosa. That was very inspiring, really beautiful, and gave a really complex, intricate, but beautifully woven story about what the Amazon can look like.
Thanks.
So thank you. Particularly, I really liked your comment about I'm not just seeking adrenaline in my life. Actually, some of us do this because we just are seeking adrenaline in our lives. But I really liked how you explained that can actually have impact. Yes, it might be a motivator for you, but the impact has been incredible. For example, the bee law is something that people here might be very interested in understanding how you can connect that adrenaline rush with what actually can have impacts for nature. But also I really liked I saw a connection between how the stingless bee doesn't sting, but it's still not defenseless. And the importance of collaborators and the people that don't explore. And now you can see here faces that are in that debate. Do I explore? Do I not? Do I stay at home? How do I do? And you can see from Rosa's talk that it is massively collaboration. So thank you for really sharing that really, really well. And that's my comment. And I know there are going to be so many questions. I saw so much writing down notes. So I'm going to turn over to the floor now and ask for questions, please.
You can speak loudly, and this is for the online.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, all the way in the back. Thank you so much for that. Just wonderful, inspiring presentation. Just really drawing on, your entire background and all your experience. I was especially interested in kind of the aspect of your research that focuses on using, the knowledge from indigenous communities to kind of develop a better understanding about potentially new forms of kind of medicines and treatments and other aspects to influence health. Can you talk a little bit more on kind of your overall kind of scientific framework for exploring that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So with the stingless bee honey, I think that was our first concrete example on that. And I think there are many ways to do that. And I think there has been, we have protocols internationally, for example, the Nagoya Protocol, and we have different frameworks. And I am sure that there are great examples of success in other areas. Yet when I look at a place like my own country, we haven't necessarily see that, right? I can tell you so many different examples, even for example, with the dragon blood tree, that is one of the most medicinal trees we have in the Amazon, where there is an FDA-approved medicine that came out in 2012, crofelemer, to treat, extreme cases of diarrhea and whatnot. where if you look at even just the patent 100 pages documentation, you don't find a single mention about ethical sourcing or benefit sharing, although them, in theory, they should have gone through some sort of protocol, and perhaps they did, perhaps, at the national level. But what does that actually mean for the local level? And I think that's something that I have had in mind from the start, especially with my chemical biology background and the type of projects that we work with, because we definitely didn't want to leave that as a possibility or a door open to do that. One of the ways in which we are tackling that on the scientific side is by involving local indigenous scientists in our work. And perhaps that means slower science in the sense as to some may have never even had the chance to have a proper scientific training. And by proper, I mean really different kinds, because in my opinion there is methods to the indigenous scientific ways in which they find fauna or they even process and share their own knowledge too. So it's just about the merging of knowledge systems, but to me that is already one way in which we're democratizing and shifting the power narrative, because now they are also getting involved in the sense of seeking for permits and in the conversations with the local communities as to if there was something developing from this, what would that mean? That still doesn't guarantee it though. So that is at least one first step, how I see it and how we all see it too. The second one, and we explore this deeply, of course, policy and law is not also my expertise, but when we learn about rights of nature, but also about biocultural community protocol, which is a type of toolkit that was developed, I think, just in the last decade or so. And so the actual examples of successes happen in local areas. So, for example, a community in Mexico that I think there was a big tequila company that was creating a whole marketing campaign about, oh, the agave comes from this area and using the agave, but not really generating more fair income or fair trade and etc. How do you even tackle that with such a big company? And relatively simple tool, perhaps to the eyes of others, that was implemented with the local people there was enough of a case for them to be able to create a solution where the company either stopped creating that kind of marketing or generating new income. And when we saw those kind of like real life cases that perhaps are lesser known, but where we have seen kind of like the impact that the indigenous or local communities are telling us directly, then we thought that that would be a really powerful framework where to start. So that we've been building alongside the rights of nature very quietly and softly, and ensuring we are including as many voices and regions as possible that work with the stingless bees. So at least now per municipality, there is a guideline and protocol as to if there is a company that wants to come and, let's say, explore more on the stingless bee honey or these other protocols, not only do they need to go through these higher level Nagoya protocol permits, but there would also be a local one where now they have to even, for example, come clean or have a conversation about what percentage will be going into what communities, or perhaps a restoration project, and who is going to be leading it too, because that's also a big component. So I've seen it from those two perspectives. At least that is what we are focusing on, is because we have seen personally what is working for us. But I think it's also being very aware and respectful as to how projects begin. For example, with medicinal plants, there has been a call from many communities that have reached out over the last 2 years. They want to create an encyclopedia of their own traditional medicine in their own language, where they define what gets shared and what doesn't. And even having those kind of conversations, which sounds very obvious and very like, well, obviously it should happen like that. When you actually look at what has been done in most, whether it's small or large encyclopedias, and whether they involve collaborations with locals or not, they're not even shared in the native language. So in my opinion, how is that a collaboration then? Just because you have someone's name in it, right? So I think it's at least just shifting those narratives, but I am hoping that by generating a work of body that has this history and is leaving this trace that indigenous people can be part of the co-authorship or fully leading it, then we are showing a different framework in which not to block collaboration, to foment it, to promote it, but just with different decision making.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think it's especially interesting to have this conversation in the wake of the recent COP, and I wondered if you had reflections on that, not only with the Indigenous-led protests, but maybe the frustration that certain people and scientists feel about inaction or the slow pace of some of these conferences.
Yeah, it's a big question. I was at pre-COP events, not at the full COP. We did had some colleagues that we were able to support to go, but I was at the 3 days pre-COP events where there were a lot of the big key players, to be honest, from government and corporate and nonprofits. The main conversation was about innovative ways for finance. That was my key takeaway from everything, regardless of anything else, with the, I guess, summary that they were seeing more philanthropy, actually, support coming into local-led projects. But I think the bigger question mark that everybody agreed on is, okay, people agree they need more nature finance. There is more philanthropy. How do you actually support local-led projects? Because a lot of that, unfortunately, goes through big intermediaries that take the majority. And I am not saying we do not need collaborations with others. I'm just saying there has to be a better model. And I think that's where everybody was kind of leading with the conversation without not necessarily an outcome. I think it's very frustrating. It is a delicate thing. And on one side, you need the visibility, and at least the visibility has improved from before. So there is some sort of a small win there where we didn't used to have this much Indigenous representation. But then I've had cases of our Indigenous leaders being invited by others and going, and in theory being promised to have 10 minutes to speak and flying all the way from Peru to Dubai without expenses paid in advance, and yet arriving there and only being, in a way felt that they were being used for photos, and that space that they were supposed to be prepared for speaking was removed, right? And then coming back heartbroken. I am sure many have faced like something like that in this case. And on the other side, like you're saying, everybody, I think, feels inaction. There was not even a mention of fossil fuels in any of the agreed upon treaties and different things like that. I think it's just showing how broken our system is. And I think people keep trying and keep saying, and bottom line, the projects where you do see hope, because I think that is the biggest thing that I take from even seeing the worst cases out there, is that there is hope and we need to make it more local. Doesn't mean you don't need the international collaboration, you just need it more local led. We're doing it from our corner of the world, from our little side, but I have so much hope to see by seeing others too, and also I think getting kind of international partners to be at least a bit more aware of and finding additional ways to support that. Sorry, that wasn't that direct answer. I don't think there's any direct for what we've seen there. I think there was a question here too.
But
Yeah.
has it been answered?
No.
No, okay. Great.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, as an Indigenous person who's had extensive scientific training, how do the two different ways of thinking live in yourself and in other people who have those sort of two worldviews alive in them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do have had the formation in both, and I think it is so easy, and it's one of the most common questions I get asked: which one's better? Like, which one do you like more, right? Or which one is giving the best result? Or some people saying, well, obviously the Indigenous knowledge will be better, or like obviously the Western knowledge will be better. When in reality, for me, it's not even necessarily a thing of comparison, but rather of integrating and making space to new ways to define work. So, for example, I'll give you a very key example of this. We were doing this new project on camera trapping. We had very little number of cameras. Usually when you're doing this kind of biodiversity assessments, you would want to form a grid and you want X number of cameras that you can put, very precisely across this grid. And that is the Western scientific method that we have developed. In the area where we were, not only did we had a tiny amount of camera traps, not the 1,000 perhaps that you would have required for a grid system, we had about 12. And also the territories where we were are completely virgin rainforest. The change altitude within 30 minutes trekking from like 600 meters above sea level to 2000. So the territory in itself being extremely, like even more challenging and difficult to access. And we were understanding from our indigenous colleagues that they knew where they wanted to prioritize to put these indigenous camera traps based on the poop, the footprints, the shape that the animals leave after they've been through certain paths in the rainforest, which even I wouldn't be able to tell you just based on the shape of some leaves if an animal has been there and which one and at what time and what direction they were moving. Scents and a few different items. And we had amazing Western scientists and this amazing group of indigenous scientists with us. And we kind of all look at each other for a minute and we're like, you are describing a method. You have your method of different parameters and metrics that you are searching. Perhaps they have not been written and perhaps we haven't necessarily quantified them yet. But instead of using a grid system, he's using all of this kind of list of items that he's dictating. So I think in this case, it is a matter of recognizing and finding, okay, how can we turn that into a method that the Western can understand? And how can the Western system strengthen that in a way that it becomes more quantifiable and replicable? So I think that's the best example I can give you on how we think. And I think it's just keeping an open mind that there is virtue in both. And then there's still a lot of ways that in which we do not know how to do things, because I think otherwise our planet wouldn't be in this way. And so by welcoming these different kind of knowledges, just finding ways to make advance both, not competing, is how at least they live in my head, because to me it was commonly so normal to see my grandmother kiss flowers and ask them for permission, and yet understand at the same time about the genetics and the chemistry of flowers as I am growing up. And yet it makes no sense that somebody would be doing that, but it is her way and the way that I like to approach it as well, that they both can coexist without necessarily hurting one another. I think there was a question here too.
Thanks, Rosa, for such a fascinating talk. I really admire the way that you're navigating different worlds, like between Peru and the UK, indigenous and Western science. And I had a question which was related to the previous, which is, I guess a lot of questions like in ecology are quite shaped by existing research agendas and the ways of thinking with which people are already quite comfortable. And from your experience, growing up in the context that you did, are there any questions that you would like to ask of the rainforest that you hope Western science will make space for in time? Like, for example, is there a way of having a conversation with those flowers that live beside the boiling river and asking them like, hey, how do you manage to live here? That would be also somehow translatable into like a scientific publication? Or does it sort of feel like maybe that's 5 or 10 years away?
That's a great question. And I mean, we know trees communicate to one another, right? We now know about microbial networks and fungal networks, and that they are literally exchanging signals that perhaps 20 years ago people would have laughed at, right? Even in a great example of this, I think it's in 1960, it was still already really believed that nothing like DNA couldn't survive about 80 Celsius until the work with PCR and Taq polymerase, that it was like, actually, no, DNA can survive in these extreme species and whatnot. And that completely kind of changed the way we were thinking. Similar to the trees, like, oh, now we know because we were not able to measure and quantify it. I think it depends on how we're also presenting the data, I think. So for example, in the case of the boiling river, within the framework that we have for scientific work, the way we have found it's finding a way to collaborate with the social science and anthropology and etc. to integrate, for example, stories of origin into the larger, very data-driven, quantifiable methods that you're presenting data. But also, I think it's creating a kind of like another way besides presenting just on the scientific work that allows for more space. So it's also not changing this whole incredible history of modern science that we have in our planet, which clearly have benefited humanity and we need it. It's not about necessarily disrupting and dismantling this system in a way that just leaves us with nothing. It's a way of finding new ways forward. So I think that is, in our perspective, how we have found it. Perhaps there are other ways, which to us means having, for example, workshops or events or different ways besides having this paper, perhaps conversations that allow for the elders with the youth, with people from indigenous communities, to academic scientists, to policymakers, to starting from the data, you have perhaps some sort of reflection of this non-scientific, but then you have these other ways of communicating and elevating. For us, for policy particularly, I think that opens the question as to how do you translate that? So having the cultural stories, whether it's in a testament or a letter, or like generating evidence, even if it's not necessarily a published scientific index article, it does still generate the body of work to be able to kind of be translated into policy. And I think that was something really important for us to understand, what we've definitely been using.
Cool, thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. And I just wanted to go back to a previous point about innovative finance. And I remember in your introductory page that you mentioned that you were the co-CEO of a science and sustainability consultancy. And I was just curious about what you did and how you think we might be able to communicate the importance and, I guess more importantly, the urgency of biodiversity conservation to, say, like the layperson or someone who's mostly interested in generating profits.
Yeah, there's a few questions there. So I do, by consultancy, I mean I do a lot of work with National Geographic. So I do a lot of talks with them and trainings for schools, educators, and educator leaders primarily. So I accept payment for that contracted work through my own company. I do some work with other organizations as well for similar content or similar projects and approaches. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And then the focus with the nonprofit in Peru, it is entirely to make the work happen and the activities to take place. In terms of innovative financing, the main conversations that I have been seeing, and there are different models, right? We've seen all the way from carbon credits and now biodiversity credits. There are different ways that people are exploring, whether it's a for-profit generates income and then it's going to donate a percentage into this. I think we need many ways in order to be able to keep financing the work and to be open as to what that looks like. But also having, that's why I kept kind of referring to the biocultural protocol or even the rights of nature, having the frameworks in place so that the financing is happen also ethically. Because I have definitely seen cases, right, where perhaps there's a major financer and then they want to own the data. And what then do we get to when we're talking about biological data that perhaps indigenous people do not want to share, right? So it I think opens a lot of windows that it's not just a matter of finding the financing, it's also having some sort of system in place that will be able to allow for it to happen ethically and in a way that everybody's happy with. So I would say that. And then your other question, sorry, communicating, yeah. So of course, communication has changed so much. Even if you talk, across like nature, science, natural history, TV, some of the major conversations is we used to have one TV, a few channels, everybody watch it, same for radios, and then that's it. Now, of course, it's very micro in terms of people are generating their audiences, whether that's 1 million people, 500,000 people, and everybody trying to find their new place in this world. Of course, now you have generative AI and what that will look like in terms of communicating. I think for us, it's when you connect with emotion, so social emotion, like social emotional learning. I think you resonate with the human side of everyone. And I think when you also show the faces of people that are doing the work, I think it is very easy to hide behind. And I think in a way that also allows for things to perhaps go unnoticed or unchecked. So I think showing that transparency by team-led, by founder-led, at least in our case, has been quite important. It doesn't come necessarily naturally for me to talk even about myself, but I noticed that it kind of led to allow us, for example, to get more girls in the communities to be really keen to talk to us or say, actually, I do want to do science too, because, you know, I see you also did this, and maybe if you did it, I can do it too, you know, or other person saying like, oh, I see who is working on this. I have more trust and transparency that I know who I am dealing with. So at least, and this is not the one way of doing it, right? It's just kind of what has worked for us. And then also, I think, showing the human side of biodiversity. So if it's just the stingless bee, for example, perhaps nobody would care. Perhaps some people would care. But if we want more people to care, perhaps somebody else would connect with the honey and they love that aspect, or some other people would connect with the stories of origin. There are people that believe that stingless bees used to be girls in a community that made the best drink, and then they became the stingless bees. And so perhaps people will connect more with that. So I think it's finding various ways to tell multiple parts of the story. And then I think that over time resonates with different people too.
So I think we have time for one more. If not, Rosa is going to be at the drinks reception just around the corner, and she's also going to be doing a book signing, I believe. So if you would like to have an original copy of her book signed by her, you can do that today. And also we can continue the conversation over there with drinks in the atmosphere room, where we're going to head over right now. Thank you so much, Rosa. That was so interesting and inspiring.
Thank you so much.